Um, Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining this session titled Green Growth, Powering Energy Transition. My name is Mustafa Bayoumi. I'm a climate change research fellow at the Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academy, and I'll be the moderator for today's session. But before we actually start, it's my pleasure to pass it over to Mr. Kleber Suarez. He's the Deputy Vice Minister at the Ministry of Agriculture and Livestock in Brazil for his opening remarks. Mr. Kleber.
Good morning, everyone. Let's start our panel. Thanks so much for Hili Forum group. I am Kleber Soares. I'm a Vice Minister of Agriculture and Livestock in Brazil. It's a pleasure for me to represent the Brazilian government and the Brazilian partner in this meeting. Your Excellencies, distinguished audience, ladies and gentlemen, it's an honor to address you at the Hili Forum, a platform for strategic global engagement. The global energy transition is not an option. It is an imperative. It's demand not only technology, but also cooperation across border and sector. For Brazil, this transition is inseparable from food security. We cannot think of energy security without access to food and sustainability. And we cannot secure food security without clean and affordable energy. The two agendas must advance together if we are to guarantee stability and prosperity. The United Arab Emirates has shown extraordinary vision in this field. Its leadership is diversifying the energy mixes, investing in renewables and forestry global partnerships is a model that inspired the international community. Brazil is proud to work alongside the UAE in this building a more sustainable global economy. Brazil today has one of the cleanest energy matrices in the world. More than 80% of our electricity comes from renewable resources like hydropower, wind, solar, and biomass. We are also global pioneers in biofuels, ethanol, biodiesel, biogas, green hydrogen, and other things like that. And now sustainable aviation fuels and renewable marine fuels. These are large-scale, proven solutions that cut emissions and expand clean alternatives for global mobility and trading. For us, agriculture is central in this history. In the past 40 years, Brazil transformed from a net food importer into one of the largest powerhouses and exports in the world. This was possible through science, innovation, and technology in the tropical agriculture adapted to our ecosystems. Today, Brazil is a recognized leader in tropical agriculture, producing abundant food while advancing sustainability practices that serve as the global reference. Our vision is clear. Agriculture and energy are not competitive priorities. They are allies. Crop and livestock residues are converted into energies. For example, biofuels, including sustainable aviation fuels and maritime fuels, reduce dependence on fossil resources while integrate systems using crop, livestock, and forest restore soils, increase productivity, and conserve biodiversity. Brazil is also recovering degraded pasture lands, expand biological inputs, and scale sustainable intensification. Regenerative agriculture is this area prevent deforestation and demonstrates that it is possible to feed the world, provide clean energy, and contribute to climate goals simultaneously. Look forward, Brazil sees wide opportunity to cooperation with the UA and the Gulf regions. Like to join these initiatives in bioenergy, including ethanol, biodiesel, biogas, green hydrogen, SAFs, and renewable marine fuels. In the same way, share knowledge in tropical agriculture and sustainable land use. Our convictions is that agriculture and energy must be part of the solution to climate change. With science, innovation, and technology, and, of course, international cooperation. They can drive the transition to a net zero economy that leaves no one behind. Excellencies, colleagues, it is in this spirit that I have the honor to open this panel on green growth, powering energy transitions here at the Hili Forum. Brazil brings confidence in its experience as a global leader in food and energy, and opens to cooperate with the Emirates and our partnership committed to a sustainable future. Thank you very much for all. The session is open. Last, I'd like to invite Mr. Mustafa to continue to us. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Suarez, for those insightful remarks, and also for shedding the light on the interaction between the energy transition with other issues like water, like food, and so on. And with that, I'd like to dive right into the panel. We will try to bring in different perspectives on the energy transition. After the panel, we will allow time for Q&A, so please, if you have any questions to the panelists, scan the QR code, and you can send your questions, which I will receive here. But first, let me introduce our panelists. We have Mr. Marcelo Brito. He's the COP30 Special Envoy for Subnational States of the Amazon. We have Mr. Anil Kishora. He's the former Vice President and Chief Risk Officer of the New Development Bank. We have Professor Benjamin Cashore, Shing Professor in Public Management and Director of the Institute for Environment and Sustainability at the National University of Singapore. We have Dr. Li-Chen Sim, Assistant Professor of International and Civil Security at Khalifa University. And we have Mannat Jaspal, Director and Fellow Climate and Energy at the ORF Middle East. And we've just heard from Mr. Kleber, so I'll move directly to Mr. Marcelo. Following up on those remarks, and with COP30 fast approaching, how do we ensure that the dialogues that we are having, that the negotiations that we are having, can actually contribute to real action on the ground?
Sorry for that. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, my dear panelists, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies. It's a pleasure to be here. I would like to thank, in the name of the COP30 Special Envoys team, for this kind invitation from the Anwar Gagash Academy and the ECSSR. It's a pleasure to be in Abu Dhabi. Well, this is a question for $1 million, you know, because we are going to the 30th COP. And despite we had huge improvement in certain areas, for example, the carbon market is already a reality in several countries worldwide, we're still lacking behind a real transition, energy transition. In my point of view, we are lacking behind because we took the wrong assumptions. We choose to talk about replacement instead of addition. Replacement is too difficult. Probably what we're going to see in the coming years, maybe around 2050, where most of the pledges and promises should be fulfilled, we're going to see a few rich countries using, let's say, 90% or more of renewed energy, but we're still going to see countries relying 100% on fossil fuels. There are different realities in the world, okay? If we look the pathway that we're taking today, we're going to reach 2050 replacing something like 25 to 30% of the fossil fuels. This is it. No more than that, with the level of investment and the level of replacement. So how we can use COPs to move from an environmental utopia discussion to a very pragmatic issue. So this is how we should move. We cannot only focus on nature-based solution, as some of the environmentalists bring to the table, neither to a single science-based solution. We need to put both together. There are several solutions in the world where we can bring a greener energy transition, but looking in additionality. Transition doesn't mean that some countries will lag behind energy because they don't have the access, or they don't have the proper investment, or they don't have the science based in their own country. It's hard to talk about partnership in a world that is breaking apart. We heard this morning about what should be a new normal or whatever, if it's temporary or permanent. In my own view, we are through a transition, in a political transition as well. And as the history shows us, it will pass. Sooner or later, it will pass. And we will come back to normality until the next crisis sits on. So let's be calm, and let's use the COP30 as an opportunity to start a new conversation. Let's remind that this is the first major event, a worldwide event, where we're probably going to have over 100 heads of states after Mr. Trump came to power again. So let's look as an opportunity to discuss freely and opportunistic. We have to foresee the difficulties, but we have to foresee the opportunities. And they are there. We can be optimistic, but pragmatic, or we can be optimistic, but without the proper realism. So if we can build ourselves as with a pragmatic view in the COP30, maybe we succeed. Let me tell you something, we are not expecting for any new negotiation or to bring to the table any new idea at the COP30. We just want to try to implement something out of the 400 promises that were made in the past 29 COPs. This is true. Over 400 promises, pledges, were done by our countries in the past 29 years. Our presidency, COP presidency this year, chose 30 out of these 400, and we are calling our COP as a COP of implementation. We don't want to implement 400, we just want to implement 30 out of that, and I hope we can get the support. I'm not looking for the COP30 anymore, I'm looking to the post-COP and see how we're going to implement this throughout the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Marcelo. And I think implementation is the key word here. In addition to, at least, I heard about the opportunities, of course. And as you mentioned, this also comes with challenges. And also a key word there was investments as well, which provides me a perfect segue to Mr. Anil Kishora. Mr. Anil, over the years, finance has always been a challenge. How do we actually ensure that we can scale up finance for the energy transition, keeping in mind that it needs to be, of course, a just energy transition?
Thank you. First of all, let me thank the Amirat Center for Strategic Studies and Research and Anwar Gargash Diplomatic Academy for this invite. And I would start by expressing my happiness with what Mr. Marcelo just mentioned, that we are not going to negotiate new agreements, we are going to implement. That is the key for transition, because over the years we have so many agreements, so we need to look at, prioritize, and fund them. So coming back to your question regarding finance, indeed it is a major challenge. And I find it a little puzzling as well. There's a kind of puzzle. Never before in the history of the world we had so much liquidity, so much money floating around looking for investment opportunities. And yet we say there is no money. So to me it doesn't sound like a supply side issue. So probably we need to look at the demand side. NDB, the Multilateral Development Bank for which I worked, we are demand driven. So if there is demand, we supply, and there was no issue at all in making funds available. So we have to look at the demand side and what can be done about it. Let me mention one case here. Earlier in 2025, UAE announced a big solar project which is going to cost $6 billion, 5 gigawatt capacity with a storage of 19 gigawatt, which is going to make available uninterrupted baseload power of 1 gigawatt continuously. So this is a very transformative project, $6 billion, and I don't see any problem in funding it. So it basically means that if you have projects which are well designed and well structured, they will get funding. So we need many more projects of that kind. And how do we do that? It's certainly a model which can be replicated elsewhere. So again, let me suggest a few pathways for a scaling up funding. How do we generate a pipeline of bankable projects? And the first one, this project itself which I talked about, is something that can be replicated, but how do we do that? At COP28 in Dubai, one of the major achievements was to announce the Altera Fund, $30 billion fund to be scaled up to $250 billion by 2030. And Masdar, which is the UAE future energy company, is supporting it. They have tie-ups with the likes of BlackRock, TPG, Brookfield to get projects. And an alternative fund manager, asset manager, Lunate Capital is funding that. So it's a team of professionals coming together to scout around, to find projects and bankroll them. So the scale, the scope, the structure of the Altera fund itself provides us with a model which can be replicated elsewhere to generate a pipeline of projects. So that's one. The second one, again, it takes me back to the COP in Dubai. The second one is about the agreement, the declaration to triple nuclear energy. Many countries signed it, 20 plus, and then in the subsequent COP also some got added. There are countries which have not signed the declaration, but they are still working on nuclear energy. In case of nuclear energy, on both fuel side and the reactor side, there have been many advances. Now you have reactors, small reactors, apart from the small modular reactors, which can be shipped in containers. So you can have base load captive power at the location where you want it. On the fuel side, again, there have been many advances. So once it is scaled up, there could be a decrease in cost of nuclear energy as well. The economies of scale will apply, new technologies will come up, and there probably there is a need to allow, and all multilateral development banks are thinking about it, to start funding nuclear reactors, of course with proper safeguards, etc. So that is the second where we need, like Mr. Marcelo said, that you can't rely on only one set of renewable energy, solar, be it wind. You need some base load. And nuclear energy is clean. You have to obviously operate it in a safe and secure way, which I'm sure the operators will be able to do. The third area is about grids, the power grids. Some time back, the Iberian Peninsula, Spain had a blackout. Parts of Portugal and parts of France also had a blackout. Why did it happen? I was looking at Bloomberg data. For every $1 invested in renewable energy, the country was investing about 30 cents in sustaining the power grids, which is not enough. You need to match it. $1 in RE means $1 in grids as well. So there are the stability devices which can stabilize the grids, voltage, etc. That will require some changes in the regulatory codes as well. Different countries, including like advanced countries like Germany, need to do a lot of work there. And once we start investing in power grids, there will be many projects which can be structured around it. So that is another area which requires investment. And finally, let me also mention here for consideration is which normally you don't talk about, but Mr. Marcelo also mentioned about some countries in future which might still be using fossil fuels. But even now, fossil fuels, including coal, accounts for a large share in power generation. And when there is any disruption in power supply, even advanced countries with deep commitments to climate and renewable energy are forced to switch to fossils. What happened in Germany some time back? When wind decided to take a break, the wind speed went down, people had to move to lignite and coal. So again, there was an agreement at COP in Dubai regarding decarbonization to reduce the use of unabated coal. And we have seen, like Taizo power plant in China, 500,000 tons of coal they are able to capture annually. So if some transition financing can be considered for such projects, it will reduce the use of unabated coal, will go towards improving the climate, and give us many more projects to make available the right kind of funding. So this is the main issue to conclude. We need to increase the pipeline of bankable projects, which then can be funded by various financing agencies. Let me pause here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Anil. I actually have much more questions now to ask. And I think you touched upon quite a few things, but most importantly, you also managed to give us examples from the ground, things that have actually happened, and perhaps some success stories that we can reflect on. But let me move on to Professor Benjamin. Professor, Mr. Marcel already mentioned, the number of outcomes from the COPs, and actually right before the start of the session, Mr. Anil and I were talking, about the negotiations fatigue, and are they delivering enough? Should we also manage our expectations? What's your take on this? And should we be approaching the negotiations differently?
Well, first of all, let me say thank you very much for this invitation, and to the Emirates Center for Strategic Studies and Research, and to the Anwar Diplomatic Academy for hosting this really important conference. I kind of want to begin to answer your question by just noting this elephant in the room. It's out sitting right there, this elephant. And this elephant is that for the last 35 years, we've been trying to design policies and discuss implementation and discuss new ideas for achieving decarbonization in line with the Paris, what is now the Paris 1.52 degree imperative. And yet we're getting warmer and things are getting worse. We're going the wrong direction. So that's an important topic for our conversation, because we clearly have to do things differently in some way than the past if we're going to reverse course in ways that are meaningful for people and the planet. So when I think about your question, I think about, well, how do we stand back and ponder why? Why have we, for 35 years, not achieved the objectives? And why do we keep on reintroducing new objectives? And about 15 years ago, I, along with 3 colleagues, Kelly Levin, who's now the chief climate scientist for the Bezos Foundation, Graham Auld and Stephen Bernstein, coined this term, super wicked problems, to characterize the climate crisis. And it was denoted by 4 key features that we said you must take into account when designing policies. The first, time is running out, which means you can't always experiment because there's a crisis happening that needs a solution before all information is in. Importantly, those who want to solve the problem are also causing the problem. So the actual debate is not with others, it's with ourselves. We all love to fly to conferences and emit carbon to talk about reducing carbon, right? We have got this internal conflict that needs to get resolved in some way. And this is a very common feature in psychology, where humans do things in the short term, whether it be smoking or whether it be weight loss concerns that actually they don't jive with our long-term interests. So we have the same problem as a global community. 3, the policy choices to date have discounted the future irrationally in ways that we know needs to be changed. And the 4th one, to answer your question, is that there's no central authority. Try as we might, we don't have a global government. And the problem there is that every carbon emission anywhere in the world is equal to the same outcome. So with those 4 features in mind, we argued you've got to think differently. And basically, you've got to think about this notion of policy lock-in. How you design a policy so that as time goes on, the commitment gets more and more entrenched, not put off, right? And if you look back in the last 35 years, we haven't really done a lot of policy design for lock-in. We've done policies that need to be achieved, but we've forgotten about the lock-in part about policies. Anybody here remember the Chicago Climate Exchange? This was an effort to actually create efficient offsets between the US and Brazil, right? Al Gore was part of this, right? It was designed very well to function as an economic system, but it wasn't designed for politics. And as a result, it died, right? So how do we design for politics is a really key question for durability. Durability must reinforce politics in some way. So what does that mean for accelerating clean technology and these trade dynamics? Well, we know that accelerating the production of low carbon technologies is a critical component to this question about overcoming these challenges. And our research that we're now conducting in Southeast Asia has found examples of policies that were locked in and successfully helped reinforce policy objectives for decarbonizing transportation, EVs in Vietnam, for example. But likewise, we found policies that have actually not been locked in, that have been undermined over time. For example, Indonesia's solar PV efforts that were well intended but didn't have the effects that the policy designers wanted. So what are the lessons from this research then, where you see some good examples and some actually examples that didn't achieve outcomes? Well, first of all, we've got to embrace the interaction, I would argue, of domestic and global politics. There's this interaction happening that I think we're not really carefully unpacking. Because on the one hand, we know that governments need domestic political support to achieve decarbonization goals. Without that, they can't get anywhere, right? And this shows up usually in terms of advancing highly skilled, well-paying, clean tech jobs. Makes sense, right? That makes total sense. But the problem is that sometimes these green industrial policies lead to protectionism. And that undermines the efficient trading systems for actually rewarding the cheapest product to get out there and do the decarbonization as fast as possible. So this tension is there because we got to find the sweet spot between how to permit domestic support, right, to get support for clean tech, but then global trade in clean tech that actually can accelerate our decarbonization. And that hasn't been tended to, I think, as a community very well. And without that, we get some really strange countervailing examples. For example, China has been criticized by the West for subsidizing clean technologies from solar to EVs and therefore creating an unfair playing field, right? They're being criticized for that, right? Despite the benefits for the global world in decarbonization. And yet it's also being criticized for not doing enough to decarbonize at the same time. So it's kind of paradoxical, right? So why? Because we haven't thought about these interaction effects very well. So when you design for politics, you get some really interesting results. In Germany, for example, 25 years ago, German policymakers said, hey, we need solar PV on rooftops as fast as possible. But there was no demand for it. They created the demand by creating a feed-in tariff, the first one in the world that said, we will offer long-term contracts, not just subsidies. And that contract locked in future governments who then, to reverse that, would have to pay compensation costs. So they locked in these contracts. And then they said, oh, if you produce more energy than you actually consume, we'll pay you at the retail rate. And that caused low carbon behaviors and massive installations of solar panels. That then created the demand that led to the increased supply from companies who now produce these goods. And more Germans then supported the policies. So that today it's now a normative change. In Germany, you've got to have a solar panel on your rooftop or you're a bad citizen, right? They did it in Germany to a great effect, and it's one of the reasons why now China can come ahead of technology and do well on clean tech. But that creating demand has been lost in our policy designs. And we need to do more lock-in, I would argue. But it's not just domestically, and I want to give one thought about what we can do globally, just to leave you with this idea, to go back to your question, which is, how do we take advantage right now of what is a geopolitically sensitive time in which we're all in, right? And we see an anti-trade dynamic emerging. And one thought is, what can we do globally to sidestep negative conversations and create positive ones? And why don't we think about having deliberations over a global trade agreement in clean tech that would allow to have much more standardized processes that would avoid this paradox in China, that would create opportunities for efficiencies while supporting domestic politics? Why don't we do that? And I've got an idea just to float out there as just an idea, which is, given there may not be an appetite in one country right now to do this, okay? And we know who I'm talking about. What if other countries said, we're going to do this right now? We'll take the lead. We'll develop these conversations. And then in 2 years or 3 years, when that country is ready to come to the table, you'll have done the work to create them and be ready for the next wind of opportunity that might come along that could allow us to create path dependencies globally that might accelerate decarbonization. So just one last thought. We know that this then is important for innovation. We know that China's innovated. We know that the diffusion to Southeast Asia has been very strong. We're having competition for innovation from Singapore to Indonesia. That's all really healthy. But I do want to just reinforce that the theme is very clear, going back to my first discussion of super wicked problems, which is that we all have self-interest that motivates us as individuals, members of different organizations and countries. But we also have interests as global citizens to accelerate the race for decarbonization through clean tech and trade. And a policy design approach around lock-in should play a greater role in achieving this purposeful mission.
Thank you very much. Very interesting points. I have a lot of questions that if we actually have time, I'll come back to you on. From the example of Germany to the lock-in policies that we have, but also actually about how do we then reconcile the research? Because you spoke a lot about the research, but usually it doesn't end up with the policymakers,
exactly.
Right? So how do we bridge that gap as well? But now let me move to Dr. Li-Chen Sim. Doctor, there's no transition without risks, right? And there's definitely risks with the energy transition. So how do we navigate those risks and ensure that we actually have a resilient energy system eventually?
I'm not going to talk about risks because Dr. Anil, Dr. Marcelo, and of course Ben have talked about the different kinds of risks. Bankability risks, risks from countries with differing needs, risks from policy lock-ins, which is also a risk because you get fossil fuel lock-ins. So you also need to design green lock-ins. So I'm not going to talk about any risks. I'm going to respond directly to your question about resilience, right? So how do we, manage to create more resilient energy systems? You mentioned grids, so I'm not going to, talk again about how you make a more resilient grid. What I will talk about is two things. One, energy efficiency. We've all talked about fuels, and most of us around the table realize that energy efficiency is in fact the fifth fuel that we can use, but we hardly use because we normally talk about the supply side question. How do we make more solar plants? How do we make more offshore wind? But we talk very, very rarely about the demand side question, right? How do we use the same amount of energy but use it more efficiently? And in this way, we can reduce consumption and therefore reduce, say, the amount of energy that we import from, the US or from the Middle East, right? So why is this important? Because it speaks about energy security, especially of importing countries. How can we have, what kind of examples of energy efficiency can I cite? Green buildings, right? We can have more efficient codes on green buildings, on efficiency so that there's less heat loss, for example. We can have more efficient public transport systems, more public transport systems, and also electrified public transport systems, which would improve energy efficiency. We can mandate ISO type of energy management systems. For example, we start with the large corporations, and then we filter down to other corporations, but mandated, not a voluntary thing. And I suppose coming especially from a Singapore angle, where our former Prime Minister said that air conditioning was the best invention ever, we can also have minimum performance standards for things like air conditioning, which we are going to need more and more of as the climate changes. So I think one answer to that, to have more resilient energy systems, would be to have a demand side kind of policies. A second thing which I would actually advocate for in terms of a more resilient energy system would be to have universities and even vocational institutes make sure that we have the human resource in place for, say, the energy transition. Now, this would include, of course, renewable energy systems, so you get people who are trained in, solar and wind and even in nuclear, so that your energy system locally is more resilient because you have a domestic human resource, right? And it's not just about human resource, it's also about mindsets. Universities and vocational institutes can do much more to future-proof these kinds of mindsets, that we need renewable energy, but we also need, importantly, fossil fuel energy. Right, so I think this kind of future-proofing, that kind of mindset, is also equally important for a resilient energy system.
Thank you very much. Dr. Sim, you actually reminded me, I was once doing an interview for a research project, and I asked an expert, what's the cleanest form of energy in your opinion, and he said the cleanest form of energy is the energy we don't use in the first place, right? So that directly talks to efficiency, actually. So yeah, thank you very much for those ideas on how we can actually be more resilient and much more efficient with the energy we have. Let me move on to Mannat. Mannat, so far we've already heard about the geopolitical tensions, how does this affect climate, but also the energy transition. What's your thought on this? How can we navigate, this current geopolitical situation and make sure that we actually achieve an energy transition?
Thank you. Thank you, Mustafa, for that question. And firstly, thank you so much for having me here. Congratulations to AGDA and ECSSR for putting together a really great show, if I may say so, and a great panel to be here on. I think to answer that, maybe I'll break that up into 3 parts as to what the solutions are. I think the advantage of going the last is most of the good points already made, so I can just sort of piggyback on a lot of what's already been said. In terms of solutions, I would say if we can look at it from what the geopolitics of it is and what could be the political solutions that we can put forward. The second, what are the financial solutions? And thirdly, what are the technical solutions that we need? Now, while there is a laundry list under each, I think within the geopolitical context, if we could prioritize from a geopolitical perspective, strategic diversification. I think we're at a time where energy transition in many ways has been held hostage by changes in government, by leaders' fickleness, by a lot of political upheaval that we notice around the world today. So can we maybe create, and unfortunately in many ways multilateral frameworks and institutions have left us for wanting more. So can we perhaps look at minilateral and plurilateral frameworks to help ring fence the energy transition agenda? Now, for instance, we have the IMEC, which is the India Middle East Energy Corridor. Can we leverage the IMEC to create energy corridors where you can build renewable energy pipelines, grid connectivity, interoperability, gas pipelines, hydrogen pipelines, look at even cooperation on SMR development and nuclear technology, or even look at critical mineral processing, which is at this point really leaning towards one country, sort of weaponizing a lot of that in the energy landscape. So leveraging plurilateral frameworks like the IMEC could perhaps be an important lever in the geopolitical landscape today, where there is that interoperability, where no country feels that they can pull out so soon because they have a certain economic incentive to participate and act together and collaborate. And at the same time, it allows like-minded countries to cooperate and collaborate and pool resources, markets, capital, and skills in being able to achieve that. Another example could be the BRICS. We have the BRICS grouping, which is a global South-led coalition. Can we perhaps think of local financing, local currency financing, which most global South countries today pay a massive premium on their capital for clean energy projects and investments? So can we leverage local currency financing to invest in clean tech projects? So I think the point that you alluded to of creating a clean tech ecosystem, right? So maybe a minilateral framework would be a great pilot or a starting point, which could then be a global commons worldwide project at some point. So utilizing the BRICS, utilizing the IMEC could be a great starting point for a lot of these efforts. And we need to diversify not just in terms of sources of energy or geographies, but also the modes of transport. We need to make sure there is road, rail, good road, rail, air transport, but also pipelines, also terminals, also energy corridors that are quite operating in parallel instead, which will prevent any kind of weaponization to take place, right? The Strait of Hormuz is a classic example. The whole world was up in air more recently when there were concerns about prices really going up and supplies being disrupted. I think second on finance, really quickly from a geopolitical perspective, also we're at a time where CBAMs are being considered left, right, and center. Europe is anyways going to implement one next year, but UK is considering one, Australia is considering one. I have no idea how the US is also considering one as well, despite backing out of the Paris Agreement. So countries are increasingly considering carbon border adjustment mechanisms. And the inevitable solution is countries in some form or the other will have to look at carbon pricing. Now, the sooner the better. They will obviously have to think what works best for them, whether it's a cap and trade, whether it's a carbon tax, and contextualize it what works for their geography. For example, India is considering a carbon market as well, which is going to be a little evolved from the PAT scheme that we already have, but only for certain sectors, only for certain industries which are hard to abate. So I think that's a great, even the UAE for that instance has started, voluntary carbon market is something that they're really pushing for. But I think even for hydrocarbon economies like the Gulf, looking at carbon markets could be an important lever to be able to push the needle in decarbonization as well. So I think on finance, that would be crucial apart from local currency financing. And I think from a technical standpoint, a lot of potential on green molecules. We focus on, for interoperability, there's been a lot of focus on batteries so far, but looking at green molecules, which is biofuels, which is hydrogen, methanol, sustainable aviation fuels, alternate fuels, I think there isn't a market for that, and there isn't enough standards that have been built on green molecules. And like we know, oil is going nowhere. Batteries and solar can only cater to certain kinds of industries like power and transport, but there is a huge market when it comes to hard-to-abate sectors like steel, cement, or even feedstock, or even agriculture. We were talking about that earlier. So where is the input for that? What is the oil replacement? And that currently doesn't exist. So looking at green molecules and trying to scale that would certainly be helpful. And I think I just want to allude to the point around comms, right? You mentioned around vocational educational training. I think the role of media. I think when we talk about energy transition geopolitics, media plays such a crucial role because, I think the whole conversation on phasing down of fossil fuels, we're just stuck on it at the COP since forever. And like you very rightly said, Mr. Marcelo, that we need to think of it from an energy addition point of view, like Daniel Yerkston, I think, popularized, right? There's a energy addition that needs to happen, not a transition, because we're not moving away from oil. We're just going to keep adding more and more. So I'll stop there for now.
Thank you very much, Mannat. I think it's quite a lot of solutions that are put forward, and then what my take would be is it depends on the context eventually, but we need to explore those different solutions, right? I have a few more questions, but I've also received very interesting questions from the audience. So if you don't mind, I'll actually move on to the Q&A. I'll pose all the questions out there, and you can choose the questions that you'd like to address. So the first question is actually related to one of the very last points that Mannat just mentioned, and it was also mentioned before. So it says, what is a realistic timeline in which we could actually achieve a 50-50 energy supply, so clean energy with conventional? So what can we realistically expect? That's the first question. The second question is, if we, and many of the speakers have actually said that traditional energy is going to stay with us for a while. Is there a risk then from underinvestment? And at least in my own analysis of this, I think there's a hint about let's not ignore grids, for example. I would imagine that's where the question maybe was going, but also how do we not sacrifice the current perhaps infrastructure that we already have. Then there's another question. What role does agriculture then play within all of this? Specific question to Mr. Marcelo. How do you expect, let's say, how do you expect outcomes, specific outcomes from COP30, given that the USA is not going to be at the negotiation tables? Then a specific question to Mannat. Do you see IMEC offering a mediation space to ease the India-Pakistan tensions? And then the last question is, are we kind of redefining the whole concept of energy security through the energy transition? A lot of interesting questions. Yeah, perhaps let's start with Mr. Marcelo.
Well, thank you. Very interesting questions. I'll grab two of those, okay? I was about to talk about agriculture. It's funny because you look at the UNFCCC convention, you look at the framework, you'll probably have like 1 or 2 paragraphs talking about food systems or agriculture, okay? We are in this very important event. We're talking about AI, critical minerals, geopolitics. We're not talking about food security. And actually, right now in the world, we are not improving food security. We are decreasing. We are losing productivity everywhere in the world. We have areas losing productivity in Brazil, in the United States, in Canada, in China, everywhere. And why we're not looking for that? I like to recall my colleagues sometimes that in between our talks about rare minerals and artificial intelligence, we make a break to eat. Otherwise, we cannot talk about it. It's funny because very soon down the road, I'm talking about like 2030, 2035, some of the common minerals that we must use for food production will also become critical minerals. We're probably going to be out of phosphorus very soon in the next 10 to 15 years. How are we going to replace that? When we talk about agriculture, it's not only food. As a byproduct, we have biomass. 30% of the electric power in Brazil comes from biomass. We have biomethane. In a country like Brazil, we only use 2% out of the total potentiality of biomethane generated by agriculture. So we are also talking in how to transform the system, addition new electricity or new fuels from agriculture. So I wonder why we are not including this very important issue in our agendas. I expect, like a data center like the one you mentioned that has been built here with this potential smart thing, we can also transform food production worldwide. But not only production, but the whole system in terms of input and how we regenerate 35% of the arable land that's gone. It's gone because of the chemical revolution that we are applying in the past 50 years. So this is part of the deal, and we have to talk about that. Answer about the US. Well, guys, of course, it's hard to lose the leader, the most powerful country in the world, in our table. It's hard. But we have another 195 countries signed to UNFCCC. We want to move. In the subnationals meeting that we're going to have in the beginning of November in Brazil, inviting governors from various parts of the world, we're expecting around 300 to 250 governors. We're also expecting some like 30 governors from the United States. So despite the fact that the USA government is out of the Paris Agreement, some of the states are not out. Most of the private companies are not out for a simple thing. It's a matter of surviving. It's a business survival. And more than that, it's a business opportunity as well. So, as I said before, we have troubles every day, we have crises every day, but they move away. And then we come back to the table again. We're going to find the solutions sitting around the table, not being out of the table. So I'm sorry, my friends from the US is not going to be there, but our friends from the other 195, 196 countries will be there, and we want to invite them. Welcome to Brazil and to the Amazon region. Maybe we're going to talk about the Belém agenda or the Amazon agenda from now on, and not about Paris agenda anymore. So it's much more sustainable to talk about an Amazon agenda than to Paris agenda. So welcome.
Thank you very much, and a fair point, actually. Let me move to Mannat, because there was one question specifically directed towards you. Would you like to address it?
I'm really not sure how the India-Pakistan debate fits into the IMEC, because Pakistan isn't really part of the IMEC corridor. So I don't think the question really applies, to be very honest. But happy to answer any other question that maybe...
Go ahead. There's one question of your choice that you...
Sure. I think there was a question around energy security. And I think that's something that is extremely crucial. While I'm based here in the UAE, I do come from India, and that's clearly an issue and concern for most global south developing countries. And I think even for India, the stance today is that while climate change and energy transition is a priority for the government, they do see it as something which will development co-benefits. So climate and energy transition policies will lead to better education, will lead to better healthcare. There will be better social social outcomes associated to that, and B, there is great economic opportunity as well. So I think the security question and paradigm today needs to ensure that we don't just look at it from the Western and the American definition of just transition that emerged from coal workers, but needs to have a more people positive and a holistic approach, which includes jobs and skilling, which includes employment opportunities, which includes looking at indigenous communities in Amazon or forest ecosystems, but also people in urban areas where the AQI is close to 700 to 800, and how their realities are very different from other regions.
Thank you. Dr. Sim, do you have any reflections on the questions related to, expectations of energy, the 50-50 question, perhaps?
Yeah, sure. Happy to take the timeline question, right? There was a question about what's a realistic timeline to reach 50-50, and I would say it's very much context driven. Right? If you ask Costa Rica, they said, hey, we've exceeded that. We're already way beyond that. We're like, 100% clean energy. So it depends on context. If you ask, the UAE, they're saying that, well, we're moving there really quickly, and we'll get there before our targeted, our timeline. We might get there in like 2040, 2045. So I think it really depends on the context. But, even if you set a timeline and you don't make it, but you make it a few years after that, that's fine, because at least you set a roadmap, you set a timeline, you give indications to investors. I think that's worth setting a timeline with, of course, reachable milestones. Right? I'd also like to take the question on energy security. Traditionally, energy security is defined as affordability, as equity, and as quantity, right? Getting enough supply. Now, I don't think the definition has been rewritten, but what happens is that in this triangle, the triangle used to be like that, it might have shifted onto one side, right? So these days, security question is more important in terms of like, do we have enough supply, right? That's become more important in some countries than, say, questions of equity, than questions of justice. So that triangle can shift, right, depending on which country you're talking about and depending on the geopolitical context. But, I don't really think that the definition has changed per se. It's just that where it stands on the three-legged triangle might just shift a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me move to Mr. Anil. And also, we received yet another question actually specifically on the finance. So let me start with that one, which is how do we improve access for the countries that need finance the most? Because those countries are usually high risk, which means sometimes the MDBs or the big funds actually would choose other countries rather than go into those countries. So how do I address this? But also, if you have any other comments that you want to share on the other questions.
So that's an important and interesting question regarding. So again, going back to that Altera model that I talked about, there are two components there. Out of 30 billion, 5 billion is a specifically targeted, it's termed, if I recall correctly, the transformation fund part of it, $5 billion. So that is meant for such countries. And when you are operating in countries which do not have a strong credit profile in the traditional sense, you need a strong promoters. You need people like we mentioned about TPG and Brookfield and BlackRock, Masdar, who know the system, who know the energy, and who bring credibility to the whole project. Sometimes a guarantee from a World Bank or any other similar institution might help. So this structuring deals which are able to get funding is also an important skill which is available with these professional managers. And so it's possible to structure bankable projects provided you have the resources, you have like wind resources or solar or critical minerals. So it's doable. Let me also mention that in some cases, insurance money can bring in the kind of long-term capital that you need for, say, power grids or nuclear power or such ventures, where the payback period is very long, but once it starts operating, the revenue generated are for 50 years, 60 years, like in case of nuclear reactors. You get revenues for 50 years plus. So it's ideally suited for insurance companies, and they should be able to invest. So we need a kind of mix of all these skill sets to produce bankable projects in such countries. And if you allow me, I would just like to add to what Mannat mentioned, separate from this bankability issue, just transition. You know, just transition, going by the example of, let's say, Germany, where we have this coal phase out by law, and it was designed to happen over a period of 20 years, 2038. It is being advanced to, I think, 2030 or something like that. The amount of money that it is costing is humongous. And the number of people involved in the coal chain in Germany may not be more than 60,000 or 70,000. If we're talking about a similar kind of phase out in countries like who are intensive coal users or coal exporters, coal producers, the number of people involved is very, very high. So how do you bring in that kind of money to really do a just transition? And I think that before we are able to really move in that direction, we need some just metrics for just transition. That is an area where some more research is required. In the context of historical accumulation of carbon, in the context of development needs, energy security, food security, how do you measure this just transition? And so we need some just metrics for just transition. I pause there. Thanks.
It's a very interesting point. I'm actually familiar with some research that was done perhaps 2 years ago, in which the researchers were looking at different emissions from different countries, but also the GDPs, like the country's capabilities, the technologies that they already have. And based on that, they gave timeline recommendations on the energy transition for the different countries. Of course, they tried to do a global analysis. They didn't have all countries on the table, but it was still very interesting to see, to your point, like what is actually, just metrics for a just transition. Professor Benjamin, I think that also leaves us with one of the questions, which is also the tension between conventional and renewable energy in the just transition. And then I'm also very keen just on your thoughts in how do we turn, some of the research or the examples that you mentioned into actual policy making.
Yeah, thank you. And just reflecting on some of the questions, I've got a couple of themes, and I want to just note something which may be forgotten. If you look at the last 5 U.S. elections for president, 4 of the last 5 saw a majority of Americans voting for a nominee that had a pro-climate agenda. 4 of the last 5 elections. So let's not forget that this is not like there's a national U.S. that is against the climate. Most Americans are for some kind of climate effort. We just have a certain way the outcome was produced last election. That will change again, and being ready for that change is really important, and that's why I suggested perhaps a conversation around global trade and clean tech as a way to advance that and get it ready in time. And I am a little worried about the minilateral discussions. I understand why they're important, but this is a global problem, and the more we retreat to regional and even national interests, the more we can't address these global dynamics. So I just would be cautious about that, although I know they're important for creating catalysts. And I was thinking about this question about security, food security, energy security, water security, and they go in both directions. They can be actually protectionist and nationalist. So I think food security has gone in a nationalist direction. We need food inside to maintain our populations. But actually, you can consider really strong, path-dependent, policy locked-in international cooperation or even minilateral cooperation that can actually create security. Singapore needs to have water, it needs to have even chickens from Malaysia. These things are actually always going to be that way. So how do we do both things at the same time, I think, offer the potential for generating the kinds of global coalitions on the climate crisis. I would offer a thought on the 50-50 metaphor. Now that I'm 61, I'm old. I have all this wisdom, and I've heard metaphors so often, and they're all new, but they're not new. They're the same, just different, just packaged differently. We used to call ESG CSR, and it's the same thing, right? So 50-50 metaphor, I wonder what it means actually. Like, does it mean we're relaxing our decarbonization efforts? Does it mean we're actually trying to find a way to achieve it? I don't know what it means. We've heard before peak 2030, net zero 2050. Those are pretty good metaphors actually, because they're around achieving an actual outcome. But ones that aren't around achieving decarbonization in line with the Paris Accord, I would be a little skeptical of, because they may lead us in a different direction that we don't want to go in. But the just transitions part, I think, is fundamental. Do you know, based on the latest study done recently, that if you ask the question, how much of the carbon sitting in the atmosphere above pre-industrial levels was put there by Annex I countries? Carbon sits there for 300 years and plus, right? The answer, depending upon how you calculate, is 80%, 85%, right? So we're still in a situation where we're blaming the developing world for a problem the developed world caused. And that's a critical just issue. But that doesn't mean don't decarbonize. It means we need to think about creating the kinds of incentives to do so. And I think we need to keep our line on not using just transitions to avoid decarbonization, but to have responsibilities for acting on it. Policy lock-in is an answer. Lots to talk about that, but not enough time.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but I want to thank you very much for a lively conversation. I also want to thank our audience for the interaction and their questions. I think it's a topic where we can stay hours talking about. I think we will be around if there are more questions. But thank you very much again for your insights, your analysis, and hopefully we will continue this conversation later on. Thank you very much.